Hey everybody, and welcome to our next lesson about proofs. Today we're going to talk all about proving angles congruent. We're going to learn about a new angle relationship, and we'll review some old concepts. So to get us started, let's kind of start reviewing. I want to talk about the reflexive, symmetric, and the transitive property of congruence. To begin with, the reflexive property of congruence states that A is congruent to, wait for it, A. All right? Seems obvious, but it'll come in handy later on. The symmetric property of congruence says that if A is congruent to B, then B is congruent to A. We can do the old switcheroo. Okay, and lastly, the transitive property of congruence, my personal favorite property, says that if A is congruent to B and B is congruent to C, well then A is congruent to C. And this one will be used frequently today, so make sure we file that one away. All right, let's get started with some examples. In our examples today, we're going to need to know about vertical angles. All right, vertical angles we've talked about before, but we haven't specifically stated that vertical angles are congruent. All right, and vertical angles are located opposite of one another when we have intersecting lines. So, example of vertical angles would be 1 and 3. Another example of vertical angles would be 2 and 4. All right. Another theorem, the congruent supplements theorem, is kind of a variation of the transitive property, but it says if two angles are supplements of the same angle, or even congruent angles, then the two angles are congruent. All right. So you can kind of see in this picture here that if 1 is supplementary to 3 and 2 is supplementary to 3, then 1 and 2 have to be congruent. All right. Here we go with our first proof. As always, we're going to start off by restating what's given, that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4, and the reason is that's given. Okay, and now let's start to look at some of the angle pairs that we've got here. I can tell that 1 and 3 are congruent. I can also tell that 2 and 4 are congruent. And I'm just going to go ahead and write those on the same line because it's for the same reason that these are both sets of vertical angles. All right. Now that we've said something about vertical angles, we can kind of pair some things together. So if I see that angle 1 right here is congruent to 4 and congruent to 3, I can say that angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. All right, and that's by the transitive property. Now it's important to keep in mind where we're trying to go. I'm trying to say that 2 and 3 are congruent. And if I look right here, I see that 2 is congruent to 4 and 3 is congruent to 4. So I can conclude that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3, and that's again by the transitive property. All right, pretty cool how that works. Let's look at another example. Same general picture. This time I'm given that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And again, that's given. All right. From there, I can again list some of the angles that are congruent by vertical angles. So 1 and 3 are vertical angles. 2 and 4 are also vertical angles. We'll go ahead and write that over here for our reasons. All right. Now, using the transitive property, I can say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. I can also say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. Those are both congruent by the transitive property. All right. Now, lastly, we're trying to prove that 1 2, 3, and 4 are all congruent. And if you look here at the statements that have been made, I've been able to state that all of them are congruent to one another. Alright, so we can go ahead and say that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. That also means that angle 2 is congruent to angle 4. We said that up here. Oops, let me back up. It's congruent to angle 3. We said that right here. We also said that 3 is congruent to 4. And this is by the transitive property. See, I told you it was going to come in handy. I'm happy because this is my personal favorite property. I'm happy it gets to use a lot. Alright, we've seen a few examples. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and pause the video and try to complete the proof. Alright, let's see how you did. We've got our diagram over here. We're also given that 1 and 3 are congruent. Okay. The next statement is that 3 and 6 are congruent, and we know that because they are opposite of one another. They are vertical angles. Alright. Next step says we need to use the transitive property. So since 1 is congruent to 3, 3 is congruent to 6, 1 and 6 are both congruent to 3, so they are congruent to each other. Alright. Next statement says that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And if we look at our diagram, we can see they are opposite of one another. They are vertical angles. Alright. And the last step says that 6 is congruent to 4, which is what we wanted to prove. Again, we can see that 1 is congruent to 4 and 1 is congruent to 6. That means they are congruent to each other by the transitive property. Alright. Hope you learned a lot about proofs, about vertical angles, and how to use the transitive property. Your next step is to try those paragraph proof problems at the end of 10.7. And then you've got a little work to do for homework tonight. So hope you enjoyed the lesson. That's all for now.